Okay, here we go. Thank you for joining. The name of the parsha, Chaey Sarah, means the life of Sarah, and is found in Genesis chapter 23. So Sarah dies at age 127 and is buried in the Machpelah cave in Hebron. Machpelah means like double, which Abraham purchases from the Ephron the Hittite for 400 shekels of silver. Abraham's, so that's the beginning, the story of the purchase of the burial spot and the burial. Abraham's servant Eliezer is sent, laden with gifts, to Haran to find a wife for Isaac. At the village well, Eliezer asks God for a sign. When the maidens come to the well, he will ask for some water to drink. The woman who will offer to give his camels to drink as well shall be the one destined for his master's son. In other words, the one who will not only, the request is specifically to give water, or the request is specifically to give water to the Eliezer himself. But if a girl would not only give for Eliezer but also give to his camels, then we know that she is kind and she's the right one. The Rebecca, the daughter of Abraham's nephew Bethuel, appears at the well and passes the test. Eliezer is invited to their home, where he repeats the story of the day's events. Rebecca returns with Eliezer to the land of Canaan, where they encounter Isaac praying in the field. Isaac marries Rebecca, loves her, and is comforted over the loss of his mother. Abraham takes a new wife, Keturah, and here we say in bracket Hagar, because the sages say that Keturah is really the same Hagar who he was married to, the mother of Yishmael, and who he sent away. And now, after Sarah's passing, he brings her back and fathers 6 additional sons. But Isaac is designated as his only heir. Abraham dies at age 175 and is buried beside Sarah by his 2 eldest sons, Isaac and Yishmael. So it starts with the burial, which is sad. It continues with the marriage. The story, really, most of the parsha is about the story of Eliezer and how he um, brings about this union between this marriage between Rebecca and Isaac. So that is, like I said, these are the big stories. There's many ways to look at the parsha, and there are many big questions that appear immediately. And maybe we'll just raise one or two of those big questions, and then we can start getting into specifics. So the first big question I would say about this parsha is about the repetition, because this parsha has, I think it's 100 and something, 100, I don't know, 15 verses, and 67 verses are the story of Eliezer finding the Rebecca for Isaac. And the problem with that story is that it is repeated twice, and some details even more than twice. In other words, the Torah tells us exactly what happened, every detail of what happened in that story. And then once Eliezer finds the girl and she brings him, Eliezer, the servant, back to her home, he repeats to her family everything that has happened. But instead of the Torah just saying one verse and Eliezer said everything that happened, the Torah repeats everything again. So that's the first question, because the premise is that the Torah doesn't repeat things unless it's important. And here it just goes on and on and on, and it's a repetition. So that story, that jumps out at you. You cannot ignore it. The commentaries, the sages, Rashi quotes the Medrash, which tries to address this problem, but I'm not sure it solves the problem. I'm not sure it solves the problem. So then you have to look at the later commentaries to try to solve that problem. That is one, that is one big question. Another big question is the name. It's very strange. The name of the parsha is Chaye Sarah, the life of Sarah. So if you know nothing and you come to the class because it was advertised as the life of Sarah, then you think you're going to hear about the life of Sarah. And what do you show up? You show up to her funeral and you show up to her death. She passes away, she's buried. Nothing, you don't hear anything about her. And then you really talk about how it's the next generation, how we're going to find a son for Isaac. And later it gets even more offensive because Abraham remarries. Not only does he remarry, so in a way he's forgetting about her, but in a way he remarries someone who Sarah, told Abraham to throw her out of his house. So that's the undoing of the life of Sarah. right? So where do you see the light? So it's false advertising. People signed on to the call because they wanted to hear about Sarah, and instead you're hearing about the first of all the passing of Sarah, but also in a way that her legacy is being questioned in a way. So that these are two of the big questions, and then there's other big questions and many, many, many details, and beautiful parsha. So much to talk about. Beautiful parsha. We're just getting warmed up. If anyone has any comments or questions, please share. Otherwise, we begin. Um, just one more big deal before we take the doctor's question. One more big deal is also in the beginning. I know Jews are into real estate, but Abraham buying this plot of land for Sarah again is also not that many verses, only about 15 verses, but again and again we hear about every detail of this negotiation. And it's like enough already. What did he do? He bought some land for the burial spot. What's the big deal? But no, the Torah spends a lot of time talking about this burial spot and the purchase of this burial spot. So these are the three big questions. Why so much attention to the details of the burial, of the purchasing the burial spot? Next question is why the repetition of the major story of the parsha, which is Eliezer's story, the servant. It's not even about the patriarchs or the matriarchs, it's about the servant, right? So that's interesting. And the third point is, what about the name? Why is the life of Sarah? Why do we call it the life of Sarah if the events of this parsha are either not relevant to her life, it's about after her passing, and maybe even on the surface, it seems like it's maybe the opposite of her legacy. The answer is going to be no, that this parsha actually expresses her legacy more than any other parsha, but that's only when you get to deeper analysis. Go ahead, Dr. Tamarin, please.
Rabbi, last time you talked to us about Abraham's legacy to all of us and how much the emphasis is on how he arose to greet these strangers, how he subjected himself to circumcision. I mean, in other words, everything focuses on self-sacrifice and kindness. Well, what
Yes.
you told us about this section doesn't
Yeah.
sound like such a great guy. And so my question is, how do we put all this together? Why we remember only his virtues and not this other aspect of him that first of all, that he appeased his wife by dumping this woman and throwing her out with his son. Then she dies, he takes her back, and he has 10 more kids with the same woman, I have to assume. So, I mean, how do we put all that together with this great, kind guy?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. That's a great question. Now, only problem is where to start from. Um, where to start from? Okay, let's start from the end. We're talking about Sarah. Let's talk about Sarah. Let's talk about the differences between Abraham and Sarah. Um, in some ways, in the beginning of the story of Abraham, which is last week's parsha, in 2 weeks, basically, there's two parshas about Abraham, and then this one. This one's sort of the tail end of Abraham, and the focus shifts to Eliezer, Abraham's servant, and then the next generation finding a wife for Isaac. But let's go back. In the beginning, they're very much the same, Sarah and Abraham. There's no divergence. God tells them to travel to Israel, but they travel as a unit. The Torah says that when they travel to Israel, they travel with the souls that they created in Haran. They didn't have any physical children, but they had many students. And they inspired many people to believe in the one God, and in fact, to migrate with them from where they were at the time, Haran in Turkey, to the land of Israel. So they're operating together, right? There's not a lot of, they're not really diverging. Um, in fact, Abraham marries Hagar to begin with as a result of Sarah's request, right? Sarah says, I have no children, marry Hagar, we'll have a child, we'll raise the child. And it's actually Sarah's maidservant. So in other words, like I said, in the beginning of the story, they're very much the same. But then as the story progresses, you start seeing that they're very different, that they diverge. And the key point of conflict between the two is especially when Isaac comes on the scene. In other words, In other words, you have the beginning when she becomes pregnant, when Hagar becomes pregnant, and then she runs away, then she comes back. But then at some point, Isaac is born, and Sarah is trying to raise her son Isaac. And however you'd explain the verse, but the verse implies that Sarah, feels that that Yishmael is a negative influence on Isaac. It says he was mocking. It's not clear what it means, but she's a negative influence on her son. So what does she do? She comes to Abraham and she says, "You have to chase him away, garesh, chase him away," which is a very strong word, which we can actually get into that. It's actually an interesting word. Divorce, chase away, divorce your son. Whoa, okay. Well, divorce the maidservant, which is his wife, and her son. So at this point, she's very protective of her son. And then it comes to Abraham. And what does Abraham do? Torah says he didn't want to do it. Vayira hadavar. It was bad. It was evil in his eyes. He doesn't want to send away his son. And I guess Hagar also. He doesn't want to send him away, but God interferes, and God says, whatever Sarah says, listen to Sarah. And yeah, he doesn't even say she's right in this case. He says, whatever Sarah says, listen to her. And that's what he does. And that's the point where you see that there's a big distinction between the two when it comes to educating Isaac. Okay? Now, if you really want to go back to the root of it all, is if you look at their names. Avraham, when he comes to the land of Israel, well, later in his life, after the land of Israel, before the circumcision, God says, when it comes before he has a child, God adds a letter to his name. He adds a hey. And he says, Avraham, changing his name from Abram to Abraham, adding the hey, the letter hey, the H sound. And he says that Avhamon goyim netaticha, I place you a father of a multitude of nations. In other words, Abraham's message is universal. Abraham is supposed to be not just the father of the Jewish people, but the father of a multitude of nations, which is interesting because most faiths want to say everyone has to be like us. But here God tells Abraham, no, there's many nations, and all those nations, they're all distinct, but they all believe in one God, and it's fine. They don't have to be the same. They don't all have to be Jewish. So Abraham is the father of many generations. What is Sarah? Maybe till now, she was also the mother of many generations. But when Sarah is preparing to have a child, now, in a way, her mission shifts. She's no longer worried about the whole world in the same way, but her primary concern is specifically Isaac. In other words, she wants to show, and she's supposed to raise Isaac to be unique, a unique child, unique amongst all the other people that Abraham is influencing. In other words, Abraham is trying to find the good in everybody. And Sarah is trying to say, we have to, once Isaac is born, we have to protect Isaac to make sure Isaac reaches his full potential. Another way of saying it, Abraham is universal. He's trying to influence everybody. And Sarah is thinking of herself as the matriarch of the Jewish people and creating a child which ultimately will become specifically the Jewish people. Now, the Jewish people have a universal message. They get that from Abraham. The Jewish people also have a specific way that they're supposed to live. That's Sarah. Now, there's going to be some conflict between those two. There's going to be some tension between those two aspects. Do I see myself as part of the rest of the world? Do I see myself as uniquely Jewish? Now, one is Abraham, one is Sarah. Now, we understand that if you want to influence everybody and have everybody in your tent and you want to broaden the tent, you're going to have to tolerate some behavior that maybe is not ideal. So that's why Abraham is willing to take everybody along. He doesn't want to send away the negative influence, right? Because his mission, not just because he's a kind person naturally, but it's also his mission. His mission is to influence everybody. So if you're going to influence everybody, you have to tolerate everybody. But Sarah could be much more discerning because that is her mission. That's her job. Now, when there's a conflict between Abraham and Sarah, that's when things start getting interesting. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Think about why does God side with Sarah as opposed to Abraham? Well, he doesn't really side with her, but whatever. We'll talk about that, and then we can come into the bigger question. But it's a real question because it's not a question. It's not just the technicality of what should they have done in their family at that point, but it's the question of what is the Jewish mission? Is it the universal mission, or is it specific for the Jews? The answer, of course, is it's both. But then the question becomes what happens when there's some tension between the two? Because again, if you're going to say I'm universal, I include everybody, you're going to have to tolerate certain things that maybe are not natural for the environment that you're trying to create. So that is the tension between Abraham and Sarah, and let's see how it evolves and how it develops, and then we'll see where this parsha comes in and why this parsha specifically is going to be the life of Sarah, because it's really the triumph of her legacy. Okay, go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was exactly my question, because we are talking about life of Sarah after her passing, basically, right? So we are celebrating her legacy as Jewish people, and a lesson from the story that we are that you are telling is that the job of the mother is to protect from negative influences. My question is, do you know what age Isaac was when she was trying to protect? Because definitely when he was older, especially when she died, she couldn't protect him. So formative years, and what years are most important for the mother to protect, to be
Different.
patient for strong character, be able to withstand all the negative influences going forward?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I don't know if there's an exact answer. The verse says in last week's parasha, Genesis 21, says the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great festival on the day that Isaac was weaned, and Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, to whom she had given birth unto Abraham, playing. That's the English translation of this book that I'm holding, but it's mocking. People say mitzacheh could be mocking. I have Rashi here, so I don't know exactly what the age is. I'm not sure exactly what age. There may be different opinions. In the previous verse on the Mishta Gadol, on the great feasts, there's different interpretations. One says it's a bris, one says it's a bar mitzvah. So maybe it's vague intentionally because different kids need different type of I don't want to say protection of a sanctuary. Different kids need different needs, but certainly when a person is young, they're supposed to be sheltered from negative influences as much as possible, and certainly not in their home, right? You can make a distinction between, you tell people the outside world is different. We have our own values, right? That's interesting. That's okay. But then when somebody in your own family or in your own home is not living up to those values, that becomes very confusing, right? So that's the problem, because that's what a house is. A house is to control your environment, not just physically to control the temperature, but also to control what values enter this home. And that's
Right.
the problem when you hook up to media, hook up to a TV or to internet or whatever it is. You have to be careful, because then the outside is pouring their values into your environment, and then you have to figure out, is this what I want? Do I want this tension? Do I want this pressure? Do I want this environment in my space, which is supposed to be a place of a haven of serenity? Right? As they say the joke, they say, what is the evening news? Evening news is they tell you have a good evening, and then they spend an hour telling you why you shouldn't have a good evening. Right. So then it's up to you if you want to if you want to let that influence into your home, because you're making a haven for yourself, for your children, etc. Okay, go ahead, Roberta, please.
Yeah, I just wanted further clarification on the change of name from Avram to Abraham. So like Avram means like high father, exalted father.
There's two different interpretations of Avram, and I didn't go into that because maybe that will be the next step. The first step is Avram. Av is father. Ram could either be exalted. Ram is high, exalted, transcendent. We could talk about that as well in a second. But another interpretation is that it's simply the meaning of the name of that region, Aram. He was born in Aram Naharaim. So in other words, he used to be a father just of your region where you were born in Iraq, between the rivers, Baghdad, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And now now your reputation or your teachings are going to spread, and you're going to become a father of a multitude of nations. So that's if you say Ram means Aram. All it is adding a little aleph, which is a silent letter or pretty silent. But in a second, we'll get to the idea of also abstract versus practical. Abraham is abstract, Sarah is practical. So in a way, we can get to that in a second. But let's hold that aside, because that relates to the burial. I mean, these stories overlap, but for right now, let's focus on this idea of Abraham as universal. His idea is to influence everybody, and verse Sarah is about cultivating the Jewish people.
But are you going to talk about Avraham? That means
Yes.
father
Yeah.
of the.
No, Avraham is the father of many nations. The Hay is many. So that we're putting in. Avraham is
That's straightforward.
that's straightforward because that's what the verse says. The verse says we don't know why the old name was Avram, right? Because we don't know. But I mean, there's two opinions. But the point is that the Hay, that is clear. The Torah says, "Ki av hamon goyim letaticha," because I place you a father of a multitude of nations. So it's clear that Abraham's legacy and Abraham's message is not only to the Jewish people. He's also the father, he's also a patriarch of the Jewish people, but he also has a message for the entire world. And that's why today there's a few billion people that consider themselves, maybe more than half the world's population, consider themselves the spiritual descendants of Abraham, right? And that's what the Torah says. That's what God says. Sarah is the Jewish people. Fine. Okay. So then you have a tension between the two. Now, it's very interesting. I'm going off topic for a minute to talk about how you're supposed to read the Torah carefully. When you have Abraham and Sarah arguing last parsha, where Sarah says, we're talking about Abraham, and she said to Abraham, banish this handmaiden and her son. Garesh, chase her away. I'm not reading the best. Okay, well, I guess it's a good translation. Okay, banish the handmaiden and her son, as the son of this handmaiden will not inherit with my son, with Isaac. So she says, banish him. And garesh is banish. Garesh is a very strong word. Comes from the word in modern Hebrew, divorce, chase away, divorce, banish, all the same word. Garesh. Okay. Abraham, this is very bad. And the thing was exceedingly bad in the eyes of Abraham about his son. And God said to Abraham, it should not be bad in your eyes over the lad and over your handmaiden. All that Sarah says to you, listen to her voice, as in Isaac will be called your seed. In other words, Isaac is your main heir. And then he says, and also the son of the handmaiden I will make a nation, as he is your seed. Okay? Now, here comes the interesting thing. So it seems like God is telling Abraham, listen to Sarah, do what Sarah said. What did Abraham do? Now, it looks like he's listening to Sarah, but if you listen carefully, you realize he's not listening to Sarah, or not precisely the way Sarah said it. So I'm reading next verse, chapter 21, verse 14. This is last week. And Abraham made early in the morning. He woke up early in the morning, and he took bread and a flask of water, and he gave it to Hagar, placed it on her shoulder, and the child, and he sent her off. But yishalcheha, and he sent her off. And we talked about this. I forgot it when we talked about this. But we talked about this in the Garden of Eden. That in the Torah, very often, these two words come together and they're saying something completely different. Because garesh means, here they translate it as, garesh means banish, but garesh means divorce. Garesh means sever all ties. That's what Sarah tells Abraham. What does Abraham do? He gives her water and he gives her bread and he sends her away. But lishloach is you're sending for a purpose. In a way, lishloach has the same word for as emissary. Emissary is that person is representing you. It's clearly not a severing of the tie. So now let's go back and ask again. Did Abraham do what Sarah said? Yes and no. Yes, he protected Isaac. Yes, he sent away the handmaiden, the maidservant, and her son, which is his son. But did he listen to Sarah? No. Sarah said sever all ties. Did he sever all ties? No. It just says he sent her. And sending, especially in Hebrew, sending means something completely different. Sending means that there's still a bond. And to the contrary, someone could be your emissary when you send them. They represent you. So now let's think about this. So who's right in the debate between Sarah and Abraham? In other words, who's right? Does Abraham have responsibility toward Isaac or toward the rest of the world? So Sarah says, only Isaac, banish everybody else. Garesh, cut all ties with all your other children and your other spouse. And God says, listen to her. But you see how Abraham understands that, not that she's right. Listen to her in the sense that Isaac comes first, but he doesn't cut ties with her. So in the final analysis, what happens? Of course, Abraham has responsibility for the rest of the world. The question is, how do you have responsibility for the rest of the world? Sometimes the way you influence the rest of the world is through cultivating your own unique identity. In other words, once you have a unique, distinct Jewish people, then the Jewish people could influence the rest of the world. But influencing the rest of the world does not mean diluting your product, right? Does not mean that saying, so now everyone's the same. So now there's no distinct Jewish way to live. And now we just have a universal message. So he says, no, when you are rooted in who you are, now you have something to tell the other people. Otherwise, why should people listen to you? Who are you? You're not different than anybody else. But if you maintain your own uniqueness and your own perspective, then you could share some of that with the rest of the world. So in other words, who's right? Of course, Abraham, they're both right. Sarah's right that you have to cultivate the Jewish people. Abraham is right that you have to have influence on everybody. Now, the question is, now they were both wrong because they both went to the extreme. Sarah says, chase them away, sever all ties. Abraham doesn't want to send them away to begin with. So Abraham is willing to put up with the negativity of that influence because he sees the good in everybody, because he's the father of everybody. Now, what's right? What's right is both. What's right is you first have to cultivate, you have to set your standards, cultivate people who are loyal to the message completely, and then find those universal aspects and influence the rest of the world. So now it becomes more complicated. Who's right, who's wrong? Well, they both have a point because both are true. Now the navigating between the two is what develops over these parshas. And now we're almost set up to get to the answer of how is this the legacy of Sarah, of Abraham, and then going back to Dr. Tamarin's question is where is the kindness? So now we have enough. Now we're set up to start discussing that. Go ahead, Vicky. In the meantime, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I don't know if you're gonna answer it later, but the children that he fathered later, like 6 children, how does that contribute to him being a father of the nations? Are they also considered his legacy?
They're considered Abraham's legacy. Well, not Zerah. So there's a subtlety there. So we'll talk about that. We'll get to that. In other words, even Abraham, who's the father of many nations, has a unique connection to Isaac, because the Torah says again, through Isaac will be called your seed. In other words, who's to consider that the heir of Abraham is Isaac. Isaac is the heir of Abraham. He's the person who inherits the legacy. But of course, that doesn't mean there are no other children. And in fact, the job of Isaac ultimately is to influence the rest of the children. But you have to be able to be somebody who's willing to be distinct and do things that are unpopular and live in a very elevated way in order to be the one that other people will actually pay attention to and listen to. So you have to have both. You have to have your unique personality, your unique way of life, but you have to realize that you have to share that inspiration with the rest of the world. So one is more Abraham-like and one is more Sarah-like. And that's the tension between Abraham and Sarah. It almost always comes down to Hagar. So you could say, well, it's just the rivalry in the family. It's that too, maybe, but the deeper point is it's a rivalry it's a definition of what the mission is. And also, if I have a universal mission and I have a particular mission, which one comes first? And in a way, so for the Jewish person living today, on one hand, I want to be part of the rest of the world. On one hand, I want to be Jewish. So is it a conflict? So maybe my Jewish identity is separating me from the rest of the world. That's maybe the Abraham perspective. The Sarah perspective is only when you're loyal to who you are do you have what to contribute to the rest of the world, and you can be and therefore you can be a significant part of the rest of the world. Because otherwise you're like anybody else. So we don't need you. We can be anybody else. So by being different, by being unique, different is a scary word. By being unique, that's how you contribute. Because if you're just a copy of the next guy, then nobody needs you, right? So in a way, by being distinct, that's how you're part of the family of nations. But if you blur the distinction, then you're not being loyal to either of those. You're not Sarah and you're not Abraham. It's counterproductive. I think today or yesterday was Rabbi Jonathan Sachs's yard site, and he would talk about this all the time even when he came to Greenwich, and he spoke, and he said that Gentiles respect Jews who respect Judaism, right? In other words, if they feel like you are anchored in who you are, then they want to listen to you and they want to receive from you. But if you're embarrassed, but Gentiles are embarrassed of Jews who are embarrassed of their Judaism, right? So it's counterproductive, counterintuitive. I would think that if I hide my Judaism, people would be more comfortable with me. But maybe that's temporary and superficial. But in a very deep way, the fact that I am unique, it now gives me something to contribute. So that's the Abraham and Sarah interaction. Now we can take it to the next level. Go ahead, Dr. Tamron.
Vicky, was your hand raised first? I don't know.
I already asked my
All right,
question.
or Rabbi, maybe Vicky and maybe or the lady who's on the call are well aware of this, but I have to tell you, this business about his kicking out the babysitters or whatever his first child.
His wife, yeah.
As well, fine. And then the minute the wife drops dead, he immediately welcomes her back and has 6 more kids. Maybe for whatever reason, maybe I ignored that. But how many people do you think really think about Abraham in that context? It's almost as if I hear it, I think, wow, I didn't know that about Abraham. It's almost
Yeah,
like
no one talks about that. No one
of
talks
course
about
not. Of course not. But it's part of the thing. So what's interesting is how people selectively pick out of the thing
Yes.
what makes them feel good, or what makes
Yes.
them feel good about being Jewish. Oh, Abraham's a great guy. But if they emphasize this part of the thing, basically it doesn't make him sound like he's so great.
But that's why you come here, because you don't want the sugar-coated version. You want the real version.
Well, you're absolutely right, because how many Jews do you think really know about the second part?
I would say that most people don't know this.
You're darn right. I mean, maybe Vicky knew it, but I didn't know it until today. I didn't know about the second part of Abraham.
But it's also important how you tell the story. That's why Eliezer tells the story twice. So
Yes.
it's also very important how do we read the story about.
Yeah. So that's the next step. Now let's see if we can inch ahead and talk about what is Abraham doing, and is it good, is it bad, and what's happening here. So there's different ways to think about it, and you could look at this as the end of the story, as in a way, like I said in the beginning, when I had to be provocative to get everybody's attention, that in a way, this is the opposite of Sarah's legacy. This is the undermining of Sarah's life, because first of all, he's marrying the person who she didn't want him to marry. She wanted to send him away, and he fathers all these other children. And later it says that yes, so it seems like it's the undermining of Sarah. But if you look a little deeper, and this is a commentary by the Rebbe, you could see it's the opposite is true, because what they're really arguing about, Sarah and Yishmael and Hagar, the real question is, it's not that Sarah is opposed to Yishmael. Let's take Yishmael as an example. It's not that Sarah is opposed to Yishmael. She, in fact, was the one who told Abraham to marry her. So you're going to say, oh, she had buyer's remorse. First she tells Abraham to marry Hagar, and then she has the child. Now she regrets it. You could read the story on that level, but you can read it on a different level, a deeper level. The deeper level is, of course, she understands that there could be other people in the family and other people related to Abraham, etc. The question is, do those other people recognize the unique position of Isaac? And that's exactly what happens here, where when God says, listen to Sarah, because through Isaac will be called your seed. In other words, God is saying, Sarah is right that Isaac is the one who bears your legacy, who's going to carry your legacy. She's right about that. Listen to her about that. Okay? Now, what's very interesting about this parsha, this whole idea, sends them. Let's read. You know what? Let's read the end of the parsha, and you'll tell me. We'll read it carefully, and we'll pay attention, and we'll see what impression we get of the end of the parsha, whether or not this is the undermining of Sarah's legacy, or the way we want to argue, perhaps the living out of Sarah's legacy. So let's see. I'm just going to share the screen so you could hear it from the Torah directly. You don't have to hear it. Well, it's not direct. It's in English, but as close as possible. Okay. This is the end of the parsha. Okay, there's so much to say about this. The end of the parsha again talks about not only Yishmael but also the lineage of Yishmael, all his children, as if we care. We care. But why is this in the story of Hagar, of the life of Sarah? This seems to be like the opposite of Sarah's legacy. But okay, so let's read. I'm skipping now to the 6th reading. Abraham married. Okay, this is not a good translation. I'm going to get a better translation. What chapter are we? We are in Genesis chapter 25. Abraham took another wife, and her name was Keturah. And she bore him Zimran and Yakshan and Midan and Midian and Yishbak and Shuha and who? And Suach. Okay, and we get to their lineage. Now, Why do I say that's Hagar? Because I didn't say it. Rashi says it. Rashi gets it from the Medrash. Says Rashi, when it says Abraham took another wife and her name was Keturah, says Rashi, this is Hagar. Don't think it's a different person. He's not marrying somebody else. Her name is Hagar. Now, Hagar, why are you calling her Keturah? She was called Keturah because her deeds were as beautiful as incense, Ketoret. And because she tied, Katra, the Aramaic for tied, her opening, for she was not intimate with any man from the day she separated with Abraham. So there's two interpretations here that Keturah represents a very positive trait. Either she's very modest in the second interpretation, she's loyal to Abraham, she doesn't marry anybody else, or even more beautiful in the beginning, Ketoret, the incense. And we know that word from the book of Genesis, where there's a commandment to offer the incense in the temple. Her actions are as beautiful as the incense. Okay, so obviously the sages are looking at her in a positive light. Maybe they're trying to say that's why Abraham remarries her, but okay, fine. Let's put that aside. We're going to hide the Rashi's commentary, and we're going to actually stay with the verses. So you don't so you could say you're not being influenced by the commentary. You're actually going to read the verses firsthand and see what you get. So we read about the 6 sons in verse 2, and then we look at the grandchildren. Yakshan begot Shiva and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Ashurim, Letushim, Leumim. Okay, the sons of Midian were Ephon and Epher and Chanoch and Abida, Elda'ah. All these are the sons of Keturah. Okay, now let's read 5 and 6. And Abraham gave all he possessed to Isaac, and to the sons of Abraham's concubines, Abraham gave gifts, and he sent them away from his son Isaac while Abraham was still alive, eastward to the land of the east. In other words, what is the Torah telling you? The Torah is telling you, yes, Abraham has many sons, but in Abraham's own mind, Abraham gives his possessions, in other words, his estate goes to Isaac, and to everybody else, he gives them gifts. He's not abandoning them, he gives them gifts, but he sends them to the east, whatever that means. Okay? Let's keep going. Verse 8, and Abraham expired and died in good old age, old and satisfied, and he was gathered to his people. Verse 9, this is interesting. And Isaac and Yishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zochar, the Hittite, which faces Mamre. So that's sort of how the end of the parsha and the beginning of the parsha connect. The beginning of the parsha is how Abraham purchased the burial plot for Sarah, and now he's buried there as well. Now, a funeral, a very nice funeral. But the sages read this funeral very carefully, and they say there's something fascinating. What's fascinating about this funeral? What's fascinating is it says, and Isaac and Yishmael, his sons, buried him. Who's older, Isaac or Yishmael? Yishmael is 13 years older. So you would expect that Yishmael should be first. Says Rashi, quoting the Medrash. From here, we may deduce that Ishmael repented and let Isaac go before him. And that is the meaning of good old age, which is stated regarding Abraham. When it says a person died in good old age, it doesn't just mean that he was old. It means that he had a good old age, meaning in his old age, everything was fine, everything was good. And if his sons were fighting, or if one of his sons went off the path, that would not be considered good old age. So Rashi is saying, Yishmael did teshuvah. Yishmael repented. What did he sin? So this verse explains that he repented because this verse gets at what was the sin, what was the tension. The tension is, who is Abraham's heir? And even though Abraham marries, like Dr. Tamarin says, Abraham marries another woman, maybe it's the same woman, then he has many sons and many grandsons, the Torah goes out of its way, both when it talks about how he divided his estate, and when it comes to the burial, to show that Yishmael himself acknowledges that Isaac is in unique position. That is the wholesome space. Now everybody's happy. Now both Sarah and Abraham could be happy. In other words, both Abraham and Sarah could make peace, could be comfortable with this situation where, on one hand, Abraham has many sons, and Abraham has a message for everybody. On the other hand, there's a unique position for the Jewish people. There's a unique position for Isaac, and this is the way it was supposed to be all around, since the beginning. What broke down is that Yishmael was mocking, and the Medrash there says that he says, I'm the true heir, I'm older, I'm the true heir. So in other words, in a way, the resolution comes about at the end of her life, at the end of this parsha, and the resolution actually says that if even after you pass away, your legacy continues, that is the true expression of the fact that you're alive and the fact that your legacy lives on. That's true life. True life is not only for the years that you're going to be on this planet, But then that ends. That's life, but it's not true life. True life is that your legacy continues and your inspiration and the things that you stood for continue to inspire others. And in a way, this parsha, specifically this part, not only this part, I'm going to add another part, which is what Roberta brought up earlier. We'll connect that to the beginning, but that's one element. And one element is that Abraham himself, also was influenced by Sarah, even while marrying Hagar, or remarrying, and even while fathering many more children and grandchildren, he is still living out her legacy. Why? Because he recognizes that the unique position of Isaac. So she was never opposed to him having other children. Her job is to highlight that Isaac has a unique position, because again, Abraham's mission on this world as a personal father, but also as his spiritual mission, is to interact with many different people. It's not just Isaac. Nevertheless, Isaac has a unique position. So here you see how these two tensions, the two poles of Abraham and Sarah, they resolve and they express themselves in a healthy way at the end of this week's parsha. So that is the pitch for what Abraham did was right, because that's his responsibility and that's his mission. But you see here how even in marrying Hagar and having those children, how he's still loyal to Sarah's perspective. So that's the pitch that's the first thing I wanted to say. So we'll take the doctor's question and then we'll go to the other point, which is the beginning. Also, the idea how Sarah influences Abraham related to Avram, where Abraham is an elevated father. Till now, we spoke about the idea of Abraham being sort of a father of many people, but there's one more, as opposed to Aram, but there's one more interpretation, which we'll get to. Go ahead, Dr. Tamarin, please.
Rabbi, to tie this in, because you always do it anyway, with our teachings on Sunday about meaning and purpose.
Yes.
Is what you finally concluded at the end of this, that basically each one of us has a unique purpose, and that Abraham had a purpose and Sarah had a purpose.
Yes.
And they had different purposes, which they both exhibited and manifested.
And in the beginning, when you have two people who have their different purposes, there's a tension between those purposes, and therefore there's some conflict. But that conflict ultimately could be resolved. And ultimately, both those seemingly conflicting purposes with some tension when they interact, and when they interact, that creates tension, but the tension is resolved. Ultimately, both those purposes can coexist because they're a marriage, they're a couple, they're supposed to be together. Now, it seems like their own personal missions are so different that putting the two people with two different purposes under one roof in one marriage is going to create conflict, and it does create tension. But ultimately, they influence each other, and ultimately, both Abraham influences Sarah, and Sarah influences Abraham. So there's some harmony that comes from these conflicting purposes. But yes, everyone has their own purpose and a unique purpose, and I don't have to be offended if someone next to me is doing things a little bit different than me, because their purpose is different than mine. Now, if my purpose and their purpose are in conflict, so then we have to figure out which one comes first, so to speak. Which one is first? And in that case, Sarah's thing was first, but that's not Abraham abandoning his own perspective, and ultimately these stories are resolved. Go ahead, Roberta, please. But you're on mute. You have to unmute.
Yeah, I'm just curious why the Torah is so unclear about, is it Keturah, is it Hagar? And then verse 6 says it's not the wives, it's concubines, and concubines plural.
Right.
I thought that, Torah tried to be as, precise as possible.
Right. So I don't know the answer to that question. I have my own theories. My own theories is that on one hand, we want to do a few things here. On one hand, we want to talk about we have a few unresolved pieces to the puzzle. Okay, a few unresolved pieces to the puzzle, and the Torah, by being vague, allows us to resolve all the pieces to the puzzle. The first piece to the puzzle and let's come at this from another question, another perspective. Rashi quotes the Medrash and says Keturah is Hagar. Keturah is Hagar. The Torah says he married Keturah. Rashi says it's Hagar. Now, Rashi doesn't just quote any Medrash. Rashi we talked about this, I think, last week, or no, with the Lech Lecha. We talked about this a few weeks ago, but it's true always. Rashi only quotes the Medrash, which the verse itself, Rashi tries to do the straightforward interpretation, and he only quotes the Medrash when the straightforward interpretation is not clear and really demands interpretation, right? Or calls out and says there's more to the story. So the Rebbe once taught this Rashi, and he said, look, what's the problem? Abraham is this charismatic guy, and he has a tremendous amount of influence. He influences thousands of people. Now, let's assume when it says Keturah, it means Keturah, it's not Hagar. So you finish the story of Abraham. Abraham dies in this week's parsha. He died and lived, and everything. And the Torah moves on to talk about. Torah moves on to talk about the next generation, Isaac. Okay, what's question? As a student, the reader of the Bible, what question keeps popping up in this person's mind? An unresolved story. So the Rebbe says the unresolved story. Where in the world is Hagar? Where is she? She was married to Abraham for a long time. She was, according to the Medrash, she was actually a princess in Egypt, and she's inspired by Abraham's legacy, by Abraham's teachings. So when Abraham goes down to Egypt, she comes back with him. She'd rather be a maidservant in Abraham's house than a princess in Egypt. So she's obviously a spiritual person. Where is she? Where did she end up? Where did she go? And so it's where is Hagar, but it also puts into question Abraham's influence. How is it possible that Abraham doesn't seek to influence and bring his Hagar back into the fold? Because when the verse says she went and she got lost, the Medrash says, oh, she went back to the idol worship. Everything is true on a physical plane and spiritual plane. She's leaving Abraham's house. It's also she's leaving his way of life. So the question is, the unresolved question is, where is Hagar? And that's why the sages say, no, Keturah is Hagar. We have an agenda. Because if Keturah is not Hagar, the question is, where's Hagar? Okay, so that's one point. Now, another few pieces of the puzzle. On the other hand, we don't call her Hagar. Why don't we call her Hagar? I think because it's offensive to Sarah. That's my own personal view, right? In other words, yes, I spent an hour saying, well, it's okay, but at the end of the day, it's difficult. It's offensive to Sarah in a way. So we're not gonna highlight that it's the same person. It's the same person, we're not gonna highlight it. And we also change her name to a positive name, to Keturah, to explain what changed. Because otherwise, if you're going to call her Hagar, the question is going to be, what changed? As soon as Sarah's off the scene, Abraham takes her back. So the answer is, she's a transformed person. So now we touched all the boxes. On one hand, we know what happened to Hagar. On the other hand, we're not being offensive. It's not offensive to Sarah because it's not saying explicitly that he married the person who Sarah sent away or Sarah forced him to send away. On the third perspective is we're also saying why he married her again, because she's a transformed person. Now, so you can do that by changing a name. Now, if you had to spell it all out, it would take me 3 verses. So in other words, I'm vague specifically because I have a lot to say. Right? When you have a lot to say, you have to be vague because it has to be able to include many things. Okay. I have it's fascinating stuff. I have 7 minutes left, and I want to go back to the story of the burial and tie this into Sarah. So let's first talk about the burial spot, and then we'll tie it into Sarah. The Torah spends a lot of time talking about the purchase of the negotiation of the purchase of the cave of Machpelah, the burial spot for Sarah. And I talked about this in the past because I think it's a beautiful interpretation. In the past, I've said, and we talked about this, that what's really happening in this interaction is that the people don't want to sell Abraham the plot. They keep telling him, we will gift you whatever you want, but we don't want to sell it to you. And Abraham insists, no, I want to buy it. And they're saying, you're the Prince of God in our midst. We'll give you anything you want. But the key is they'll give it to him. He doesn't want to take it as a gift. He wants to buy it. And he ends up overpaying 400 coins of silver. He ends up overpaying for this part of land, and he has his burial for his wife. What's at stake here? Why don't they want to sell it? And why does he want to buy it? So there are all kinds of interpretations. I'm going to go with one. The idea is like this. The idea here is that in those days, who got the right to vote? Who decided how the economy is going to run or how the city is going to run? You have to be a landowner. They come to Abraham and they say, you are a spiritual person. Nasi Elohim, you're a prince of God. You're a priest. You're a spiritual person. You have no business owning real estate. Because if you own real estate, that means you want a right to vote. You want to say how we should live, how much taxes to collect, and when we should pick up the garbage. They say, you're a spiritual person. You should be involved in spirituality. Don't worry about the day-to-day life in this society. And selling you land means we're selling you the right to vote. And Abraham says, no, I have to live here. I have to be part of this society. I have to have a say in the way the economy works. And eventually they agree and they let him, and they sell him this land. So that's one detail. Another detail, and then all these details are going to come together. Another detail is God promises the land to Abraham multiple times. Years ago, 50 years before, God says, I'm going to give your descendants this land. In Abraham's life, he is not a landowner. He is a wanderer. He moves around. He has tents. We have no record of him buying land. To buy land, it's not just buy land. It's that people are selling you land. It means the locals, the local people acknowledge that you have the right to be here. So Abraham is living on the land, but he's not considered someone who has the right to settle here, even though God gave him the promise. And the first time people sell him land, which means it's not just the individual that sold to him, you see in the negotiation, the whole tribe has to agree. And it's a strange negotiation because he's negotiating with one person, Ephron, but it's also in the presence of all the people of Chet, the entire tribe, because that's the way it works. To sell land, you could talk about the price with the person who owns the land, but the question becomes, the tribe themselves have to allow you to sell land, because that means they're giving you the right, they're giving you legitimacy to live in this place. So Abraham has this abstract promise from God that you will get the land, but that promise did not come into fruition until Sarah's death. When it comes to Sarah's death, it's the first time that Abraham or any of his descendants, Abraham buys and places a tangible estate in the land of Israel. Okay. Let's try to put this all together. One of the differences between Abraham and Sarah, in addition to the one we said before, that Abraham is universal and Sarah is particular, Sarah is specifically for the Jewish people. Another thing is that Abraham is the abstract and Sarah is practical. And that's the meaning of Avram. Avram means exalted father. In Judaism, Av, or in Kabbalah, Av, father, is associated with wisdom. Exalted wisdom. Abraham is a man of ideas. He's not a practical person. He's not looking to own land, and he's not looking to be a voter. He's not looking to creating policy of how to live. He's teaching the abstract ideas of abstract morality. In other words, the ideas of morality, but how to implement it, that's not so much of his domain. Sarah is much more practical, and that's why Sarah herself is able. Abraham sees the good in everybody, because he's not such a practical person. Sarah sees the practicalities of the real world, and she realizes some people you have to separate from. So you have that tension that keeps going on. That is why it's no surprise that the first time that Abraham, who's teaching abstract ideas and has an abstract promise from God to get this land, the first time he's forced to actually buy land and settle in a practical way and giving a tangible presence for him in the land of Israel, plus the right to vote, which means that you have to now practice your ideals and create and implement it in the way people operate, implement it in society. That all happens in association with the passing of Sarah, because that's what Sarah represents. So when does Abraham become practical? At Sarah's funeral. So you could look at that as the demise of Sarah, or you could look at that as Abraham now is being influenced by Sarah. And now he starts caring about the things that Sarah cared about. You could say it in a practical sense. When Sarah's no longer here, he has no choice but to pay the bills. But in a way, you could look at it in a more spiritual sense and say that this is the triumph of Sarah's legacy over Abraham, because Abraham is in the world of ideas, and the ideas, Abraham is universal. You could believe in God wherever you are. You could live in New Zealand and believe in God. But Sarah is about, could you take a specific piece of land and create a society where the morality of monotheism will play itself out in a practical way? That's Israel. That's Abraham buying the cave of Machpelah. That is Abraham being influenced and transformed by Sarah. That is the triumph of Sarah's legacy that continues even after her passing. So that's the pitch of how we didn't really get to the main part of the parsha. We got the beginning and the end, but at least we explained why this is indeed Chaey Sarah, the life of Sarah, because Sarah's legacy is perpetuated in this parsha, even though at the surface it looks like her demise, it looks like her burial, and it looks like the other people are coming into the home, but really in those stories themselves, you see how her influence lives on. And her influence actually shapes Abraham, and therefore shapes the Jewish people. So that's the pitch. Thank you all for joining. Have a wonderful day. Comments, questions are always welcome. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Take care. Wonderful day.
May I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Based on today's teaching, I never thought about the name Ram before. But the point is, when you said Ram, I thought of Rahm Emanuel,
Right.
was a well-known Jewish
Yes.
politician and still continues to be. He was mayor of Chicago.
Yes.
And my question is, was he given that name with a specific notion of elevation when he was a child? And are many people given that name? Because I've never heard that name before or since. Ram, except when you talk today about the meaning of the word Ram, meaning elevated.
Yeah, that's his name. His name is Ram Resh Mem, which means comes from the word elevated. Yeah, yeah.
Well, but what I'm saying is, do you know anybody with that name? Because it's very, very interesting.
Yeah, so Shoshana writes from Israel that one of the hostages has that name as well.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you, Shoshana. Okay, so it's an unusual name, but one would think it would be uh, a frequent name, perhaps based on just what you've said about
Right.
Ram and Abraham. I mean, that's just a piece of the Abraham name. Abraham's the frequent
Yes.
Jewish
Yes.
name.
Yeah, and we use that word a lot in the liturgy where we say God is elevated. Ram al kol goyim, God is elevated. So Ram is elevated. It's interesting, actually. I'm just opening the Hebrew Wikipedia. Here it says that there was a member of the Lehi, which was one of the underground groups that fought the British before the state of Israel, before the establishment of the state of Israel. And he's named after one of those fighters whose actual name was Rachamim, which means compassion. And they took the first letter and the last letter and made it Ram. So if this is correct, then they had a different intention. But either way, the word Ram is a real word. It's not just a made. It's a real word that has a meaning, and it means elevated.
Okay.
So that's very interesting.
Very interesting. Well,
Yeah.
one of the things that happens in your seminar is I always find that I'm seeing things that I never saw before, because I'm seeing meaning that just never occurred to me before. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you for
Thank
joining.
you.
Take care.